Hi everyone. You may think that this video is about wind chimes based on the title, but it's not really about wind chimes. The overarching theme of this video is about a problem called Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox is about getting from point A to point B and how that's impossible. Because to get from point A to point B, you first have to get halfway. And once you're here, to get from here to point B, you need to get to halfway. And then you need to get to halfway, you need to get to halfway. And because of that, you can never actually get anywhere despite constantly making progress. As a maker, there are certain items in the world that are afflicted by Zeno's paradox, in that you can try and try and try to make them perfect, but you'll never make them perfect. Not everything is affected by this paradox, like lighters, for example. Zippo lighters achieved the perfect lighter back in the 50s, and they've never had to change it. They've never had to update it. It's perfect. And so it's stayed the same. But there are certain items out there that we use and walk past and look at every day that have phenomenal amounts of detail and science and finesse involved in making them, all in the pursuit of a perfection that is unattainable. Like scissors, which we've covered on the ForgeCast before. Things like chairs. The amount of work that goes into making the perfect chair is phenomenal, and then it's not going to be perfect anyway. But one of those things is wind chimes. And wind chimes, everybody sort of thinks of them as this kitschy thing that people have to make the nice little ding-dong noises when the wind picks up. But to actually make a wind chime properly involves a phenomenal amount of physics knowledge, and I wanted to go over just a bit of the basics, not the whole thing because otherwise this will be a 20-hour long video, but I wanted to go into a little bit of the basics because one of my biggest obsessions in life are these items that are affected by Zeno's paradox. I love trying to make them, and I love trying to go on that journey to trying to reach a perfection that will never be attained. This is why I make knives, because knives are one of those things. There's no such thing as the perfect knife. You can't do it, but you can keep getting better and better and better and better, and it still won't be perfect. But wind chimes are in fact a metalwork project, so being an ironwork channel, it's still in theme, but I wanted just to sort of open your eyes to the mundane items that aren't that mundane. And some people take wind chimes very, very seriously. When you've heard properly made wind chimes, everything else sounds like tinny garbage. It's a true beauty of a symphony of harmony when it is done right. And just to make your wind chime game jump up a phenomenal way, you only need to apply a few core differences in your methodology to making them. Now, the reason I'm doing this video is because on the ForgeCast I talk a lot about these items that are afflicted by Zeno's paradox. Talked about the scissors before. I've even brought up chairs before on the ForgeCast because I'm that kind of guy. But I had casually mentioned that wind chimes were one of these, and one of the listeners, Jake Largen, wanted to make a set of wind chimes for his grandmother, I believe. The set he made was quite nice, but he ran into problems with getting it to sound right, and he asked whether or not I had any tips for him, and I thought, there's no way I can just over instant message sum up what needs to be summed up to get wind chimes sounding right. So I told him I'd make a video, and I thought overall this video doesn't need to just be about wind chimes. It needs to be about seeing the, kind of like what Bill Nye, the science guy, says, if you look at anything close enough it becomes interesting. Wind chimes are one of those things. So hopefully you can take a bit of the perspective from this video and apply it to the other things that you're making. But I won't ramble on. Let's get into some of the most common things that are done wrong and talk about how to fix them with wind chimes. So this is a badly hung wind chime. Now, the parts of a wind chime you're all familiar with. You've got whatever's holding it at the top, you've got cord attached to a tube, usually metal, but sometimes wood. Not a fan of wooden ones myself, but usually metal. You'll have something that's actually striking the wind chimes, and then hanging down from that you'll have some sort of flap to catch the wind and blow it around. So we're going to focus just on the hanging point first. This is very badly hung. Now, the reason it's really badly hung is because it is inhibiting the function of the tube. Now, the reason that wind chimes work is that you have a long tube that is hollow, and when a vibration happens, it creates a sound wave which resonates back and forward. So it hits the inside of the tube and goes bounce, 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 and then sonifies out either end. Now, you get a dual tone because where it is struck will depend on how long it takes this tone to get out one end and how long it takes to get out the other end. So you get a harmony within each tube, basically. So the reason this one is hung badly is because for resonance to happen, you need to have as little contacting the tube as possible. So obviously, if I were to hold the tube and tap it, nothing's going to happen because I'm holding it. If I let it go, it can get some resonance. So you get a tone compared to if I hold it, because my hand is blocking the resonance. But this is very muted. It doesn't ring like a bell, and it's because the string that's holding it is actually touching it in two places here. And that's the same as me holding it like this. So anything touching it is going to be bad, even if it's touching it lightly. So let's bring these closer together. So these are closer together now, and they're lightly touching it, but not touching it as firmly as before. Listen to the difference. Already sounds better, right? But what if we bring them together completely, where they're hanging down inside the center of the tube and not touching it at all? I'll get into how to do that in a little bit, but listen to this. The difference compared to this, compared to this. So, very bad, kind of bad, pretty good. Don't have anything touching the actual tube. Main point. You want to have, of course, you're going to have it touching something because it can't be floating in air. Floating in air would be ideal. If you can come up with some sort of magnetic hovering levitation wind chime, you'd be doing great. But we need to minimize contact on the pipe in order for it to actually work. Now, how to mount them, I'll get into very shortly, because the next step we've got to work out is where to actually put the mount. That matters more than any other aspect of the wind chime build. Where that hole gets drilled is not an arbitrary value, it is very precise value, and it depends on a lot of factors. So let's have a look at that, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's take a tube that we're going to be using to make a chime bell, and currently it has no holes drilled in it. Now, where we find out how we're going to actually hang it is pretty straightforward, but it takes a good ear for tone. Now, if we were to take, let's have a look, here's one I prepared earlier. We take one like this. The actual hammer that strikes it should always strike it near the very bottom, as close to the bottom as you can. You get a lovely tone. Compared to if I hit it up here, hard to pick up on camera, but there will be a point where it will get the longest, richest tone, and it will be in the bottom, probably fifth of the wind chime. Now, this is one I tuned specifically earlier, and we'll get back to this one. But what we're looking for is where to drill this hole. Now, let me show you just how important that is. Now, you can use your fingertips. You can hold the tube on directly opposite sides so that it can still pivot. So hold it as little as possible. And you take a wooden dowel and you hit in that bottom fifth. Nothing. So we move all the way down here. Nothing. Let's go halfway between them. Ooh, getting a bit better. So we'll go up a little bit. Worse. So down. Very close. that's it. Now, notice what I just did. I'm holding it so loosely that once I got close and started doing striking, it vibrates in my hand to create that resonance, but the vibration will slide it closer and closer to the perfect point. Listen to the tone. There it is. That's the perfect point, and that's how you know that you've found your resonance point. So with your fingers clamped there, you can get a center punch and punch a little guide hole where we're going to drill it, and then drill a hole all the way through. And there we go. It's drilled, and most notably, I've actually deburred the sides of the hole. Now you want to not only deburr the outside but the inside, because little wire fragments contacting whatever you put through here is enough to mute the ring. So once again, now that we've actually got this point, I can hold it here in my fingertips and hear that nice rich tone. I'll put it nearer the microphone so you can hear it. Lovely. So you can use a tuner to find out exactly what tune this is, and basically you can start shortening it if you want to get a higher pitch. Obviously you can't lengthen it to get a lower pitch, but it's better to start with a longer piece and get shorter. So you can shorten it until you get exactly the pitch that you want. There is actually a formula. I won't get into how complex it is, but there is a formula that you can work out what the diameter of the tube is, the wall thickness of the tube, the length of the tube, and the material of the tube, and put these things together into a chart and find out exactly what note you're going to get out of that tube. That's if you want to get super nerdy with it, but really just try and find things that you like the sound of. But now that we've actually got this whole countersunk, deburred and reamed, we can now mount string to it, and there are two ways to do this. Now there are two right ways to do this. One of the right ways is much superior, and the other way is easier. But to be honest, they both produce a really good sound. The actual correct way is to run wire through here that is actually, it doesn't just go straight through, it goes in at a triangular patternation, and the string is looped through the triangle, and that way gravity makes the string stay away from the walls of the pipe. That is the perfect way to hang your tube on the string. But it's quite finicky, it's fiddly, it's difficult. There is a way to do it, there are multiple ways to do it, but really it's just it's a pretty straightforward process. It's just fiddly, very fiddly. The easier way to do it is to simply string through the holes, but mount it so the string stays away from the pipe. Now the reason this isn't as good as the other way is because you have a soft texture touching your pipe. Now soft things are going to dull the resonance, but to be honest, this still sounds pretty nice. Not much going on there that's you know, not nice to listen to. Figuring out which one is for you is going to come down to how much patience you have. Side note here, before I forget to mention it, always make sure to get rid of any burrs on both the inside and the outside of the cut ends of your pipe. Very important. But once they are mountable, we can start working out how to position them in order to get the best sound and the best resonance. Okay, so we've got them mounted up here, and you'll notice that they're mounted with the tops not in line, but the bottom's in line. Now, that's another big mistake I see with a lot of wind chimes, is that they have all the tops in line, but the bottoms are hanging all sort of mismatched. And while that's more aesthetically pleasing, it doesn't necessarily work great, because remember, the resonance point to strike is at the bottom, but the resonance point to hang is at different points. So you can see that distance there is different to that distance there. So you can't hang them all from the top and expect to get good tone. Here, we get lovely tone, and our hammer is actually going to be here. So it's the next thing that you really need to think of, is how are you going to hang them from your top disc so that the strike point is the same for all of them. And this is going to get very fiddly when you start increasing the number of chimes. I like to do, as a basic one, just 4 notes, but you can see anywhere up to 16, 24 notes. It depends on how far you want to take it, really. And that string needs to be the correct length for all of them. So another thing to factor is how strong is the wind going to be to strike them, because if I strike this one gently, you get the nice tone. You see how it starts wobbling too much? When it wobbles, the pipe wall connects with the string at the top and mutes the sound. So if I strike it lightly enough that it doesn't, I get a nice tone. But if it gets hit too regularly, it starts flipping around because of this. But if I was hanging it from a shorter string, like this, it wouldn't get a chance to, because it won't create as much wobble. But if it's nice and long and hanging down like this, when it gets struck, it wants to wobble quite a bit, and that's going to mute it, which kind of defeats the purpose. This one, you'll notice, that nice short string means that it doesn't mute itself. So you can overcome this problem by having the style with the string going through and up like that, but it's still going to rock, and rocking is going to make it touch the hanging string. As soon as it touches the hanging string, there goes all of your resonance. So keep that in mind. You want to keep this distance as short as humanly possible in order to make the risk of muting the chimes as small as possible. So now that we've got the positioning of the hang point and the style of hanging out of the way, let's have a look at our knockers. How we strike the chime is going to make a big difference to the tone. Now, if you've been watching my channel, I presume that you have a little bit of an interest in blacksmithing, and so because of that, you probably know the theory behind rounding hammers or turning hammers. So having that rounded face to the hammer makes the contact point between the hammer and the work smaller. So even though the amount of force that it is striking with stays the same, the surface area that it actually makes contact is smaller, and so more force gets put into the work at that point than it would if it was a flat surface of the hammer spreading it over a large area. The same works with the clapper or the hammer of a wind chime. How you shape the hammer itself is going to determine what sort of tone you get. Now, I was using a round wooden dowel to do my test hits, and that makes a brighter sound. The brightness is the sort of the sharpness of the tone, more of a ding and less of a dong. So I'm using technical terms here. So usually your hammer is going to be some sort of disc that is hanging from a central thread, and then out the bottom it will be another thread that goes down to your wind catcher. So it makes sense often to be a round disc like a hockey puck that sits in the middle of the wind chime so that it can hit on all directions. Now, what the sides of that hammer are doing are going to matter to the tone that you get out of your wind chime. Allow me to demonstrate. So we have here a few different options. Here is our little tone maker, nice short thread, and our round dowel. Nice bright round tone. So let's take a square hammer and hit it on the side. Different ring. And if we increase the surface area even further, Notice how you can hear the clap? And if we put it on a corner to be a sharp point, very, very soft. So think of the shape of the sides of your hammer because it will impact the tone. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, let's just say you want to have a side like that. If the hammer is here, hanging from a central stem, by the time it actually goes up and hits your piece, it's actually going to be contacting on a corner, because it will not move sideways, it will move up because it is swinging. So if it's hitting there, you need to actually angle the sides if you want to actually get that flat that it's hitting. Experiment with different shapes and find the tone you like best before you make your hammer. And while we're on the topic of hammers, you might live in a particularly windy area. Now, wind chimes have a big weakness in windy areas, and that is everything getting tangled up. And the most common one is that the hammer and the flap will actually go up so far in the wind that it will wrap around one of the bells and tangle itself up, and it won't make any sound at all. But there is actually a solution, and that's called an encased wind chime, or an encased hammer. And they look kind of like this. And basically you would cut it out on a scroll saw, and when you've got that there, you then thread your wind chimes through the holes. So as it moves around, it doesn't actually ever have the ability to escape the wind chimes, unless you're in a hurricane. Wind chimes in a hurricane is hectic, but everything is hectic in a hurricane. So encapsulating like that works just as well. However, when it swings one way, you're hitting two chimes at once, sometimes more. So keep that in mind with the tones that you're getting out or hoping to get out of it. If you're looking for precision, this may not be the way for you, but if you're living in a windy area, you can never expect precision out of wind chimes. So the last thing is actually the wind catcher at the bottom. Now, wind catchers come in all different shapes and sizes, but a lot of people use them as a decorative element and forget they are actually designed to capture as much wind as possible. Now, there is a problem in wind chime fabrication, funnily enough called the ding-dong problem. I don't know why they settled on that and not something like the doorbell problem or the two-tone problem. But basically, if you live in an area that has a prevailing wind, and that may not necessarily be because nature is giving you a prevailing wind, but you may just have be in a position where the construction of houses in your area creates a natural wind tunnel. It means that the wind's always going to come from one area, and if it only ever comes from one area, then it's only going to make it swing on one axis, which is going to hit only two tones, more or less, on your wind chime. So a ding and a dong. So if you want to avoid this, considering that you're trying to make something that is capturing as much wind as possible, I've seen people do like just a crucifix hanging from the bottom, or maybe even a small bell or something, as if it's the weight pulling it down that causes the motion. It's not, it's capturing wind. So one thing you can do, instead of having just a normal paddle that's just a rectangle of material more or less that acts as a flap that catches the wind, it's two options you can actually have. One is to give it a cross pattern from, if you're looking down on it, it will look like this. That way, no matter where the wind goes, it will catch. However, that can cause spinning, which can cause knots, which can lead to the thing falling apart. The best way to do it is to actually have your wind catcher, the string mounted in the middle, and have it so that it tilts at an angle, like this. If it tilts at an angle, it is more likely to catch wind from all directions. So it will naturally want to spin some, and that will just help aid the catchment of the wind coming from any directions, and it will push it in a more unpredictable, uncertain motion. It may not look as visually appealing, but when you think about it, the function of a wind chime is not necessarily how it looks as its primary function, it's how it sounds. And so the last point about wind chimes that I'm going to talk about is material selection. As I mentioned, I'm not a fan of wooden wind chimes. You're not really going to get as much resonance, you're never going to get long tone out of a wooden wind chime, but you know, they seem to still be a staple at craft fairs everywhere. I don't know why. If you're into wooden wind chimes, I say go for it. The ideal material for wind chimes is steel, preferably stainless steel, since wind chimes by their very nature are more likely going to be outside than in, which means they have to withstand weathering. And while you can make wind chimes out of any sort of tube, stainless steel will stand up longer. That being said, you can actually make quite successful wind chimes out of copper, brass, bronze, aluminium even. You'll get different tones out of each of the different material types because they have a different internal resonance frequency. Steel, I find, gives the richest, nicest tones, the longest rings, and has the most precision in being able to tune it. And the ability to get stainless steel for this task is just really invaluable. Copper oxidizes particularly in a particularly ugly fashion, but then again carbon steel does too when left outside and it goes all rusty. It's still, though, the rust that forms on carbon steel I find more attractive than the white and green powdery nonsense that forms on copper, making it look like it came from under the sea. Looks like your wind chime was part of the Antikythera mechanism. You don't want that, so do play with it. But if you are going to use something that does oxidize over time, think about perhaps sealing it or doing something to prevent that, even if it makes it a regular maintenance thing. Now, I've learned that some wind chimes is actually a family in Japan that uses tamahagane traditionally made tamahagane to make wind chimes. I've never heard those wind chimes, but I imagine that it would be beautiful to listen to, because all of the work that goes into making a tamahagane would not be then taken and slapped together into a shoddy wind chime. I imagine that family knows all about the science that I'm talking about. So the thing that you're looking for, the value that you're looking for, is what's called Young's Modulus of Elasticity. And we've talked about Young's Modulus of Elasticity before when talking about rebound on anvils. Different carbon steels that have been hardened to different values have a different modulus of elasticity, and that creates resonance. Something's the modulus of elasticity is basically the amount the amount that a material can deform and still spring back to its original state. Going past that basically makes an object deform permanently instead of temporarily. So when you think about that, it's sort of like a surface of an anvil. When you strike it, will deform and then snap back. And that's what gives it resonance, because it will vibrate rather than just deform. Plasticine does not vibrate. You hit it and it squishes, and that's it. Hardened steel vibrates. Hardened copper, hammer hardened or work hardened copper vibrates. And this is what you need to consider when you are making something that generates sound through vibration. So, as I said, there is an actual formula for combining the diameter, the wall thickness, the length, and the material of a wind chime bell to find out what tone you're going to get. However, just experimenting with them is a much more fun and creative way to go about it. Okay, so I have here a test rig, and I recommend you make one of these if you're going to make wind chimes. Basically, it's a 4-point hanging rig which allows me to hang bells that I make to tune them and to find good pairings, etc., before you actually go threading them into the final piece. So if you're going to do this a lot, it's really good to have a test rig set up for each of the different numbers of bells that you're going to use. Also, nice little default flapper for the bottom. Once again, not the final flapper, not the final hammer, not the final top. This is just a skeleton upon which to hang your bells to make sure that they work. Now, one thing to note about actually seeing them on here is how effective of a flapper you need. Smaller wind chimes need a smaller flapper, but they also need a lighter weight flapper to be able to move it. A heavy flapper is not going to be pushed as easily by the wind. So light, large surface area is really good. If you're making it out of scrap, old CDs are really good for this. The hammer here can be raised and lowered because it's just knots holding it in place. I can undo the knots and reposition it depending on the tubes that I'm using. But it also lets me see how far the knocker has to travel to actually hit the bells. The more distance it has to travel, the harder it's going to hit them when it does, because there's more swing behind it. However, the more wind it's going to need in order to move the hammer, and that's going to be a direct relationship between the size of the hammer and the size of the flapper. So in my workshop I have various different size flappers, various different size hammers, and various different top plates with numbers of hanging points on them. So good idea to do this setup if you're going to be making these as part of your craft, because tuning a wind chime is an arduous process. But it's nice to actually finally get to hear it. So, one last point before I let you go. The order in which you hang the bells from your hanging point is going to be important, because when you think about it, that central hammer is going to always be swinging, not often going to be swinging in a curve. It's going to be swinging in a line, and each time it swings it's going to swing in a different angle. And so you need to think about pairing the notes. Make sure that it sounds good to have opposite notes sounding right. A good way to do this is to have the longest one and the shortest one on opposite sides, and then from there space them out so that the next longest is there and then the next shortest, so they crisscross and crisscross all over the piece. It's a good rule of thumb, doesn't always work. It's a really good place to start though, and when you're actually going through to hang it, try different combinations and then stick it in the wind and see if it sounds good or not, because you're looking for pitch harmonies, and pitch harmonies are it's a taste thing to an extent, but really there are certain rules in musical theory which I'm not going to go into. You've already been getting enough nerd theory as it is before, without me going into that. So I'm going to yeah, just leave you with that. Experiment with that. Having it finished and hung up and singing in the wind does not necessarily mean it's done. Listen to it for a while. See if there's any notes that fall flat or don't seem to pair well with the other note that it keeps singing along with. And it's okay to rearrange them and untie it and retie it and play with it. Just think you're going to be listening to this thing every single day. You want it to sound nice, so put a little bit of thought into that. And so I will stop boring you about the nerdiness that I get out of making wind chimes. I've made a few in my day. I've never made one that I would consider perfect because, like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't think it's possible. But it is a noble pursuit, because while it is not a functional thing, it is a beautiful thing. And this is what we do as craftsmen, craftswomen. We make beautiful things, or we try to. And trying to attain that perfection is a noble goal, even if you never expect to reach it. So keep that in mind and have a go at making some wind chimes. You'd be surprised just how complicated they actually are to get right. And once you've actually got a set that you are happy with and that sounds lovely to listen to, it can actually be a real joy to wake up to and to go to bed to. So I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're making beautiful things. I would just like to say a big thank you to my patron family on Patreon, who have helped me support this video and all of my videos and all of the work that I do. And if you aren't already, please like and comment, subscribe if you're not already, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.